Today's daf is Menachos daf Ayin Zayin, and we are 2 lines from the bottom of daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis, the 8th perek of Masechtas Menachos, Perek HaToida. So, Perek HaToida, as its name would suggest, discusses the Korban Toida. The Korban Toida is mentioned in 2 places in the Torah. It's mentioned in Parshas Tzav, Ba'arichos, and then it's mentioned again Bekitzer in Parshas Emor. Parshas Tzav, the Torah says, "V'zois Toras zevach hashlomim asher yakriv l'Hashem." So the Torah is introducing a carbon shlomim, and then immediately al toida yakrivenu, if the carbon that's going to be brought is a carbon toida. So are we talking about a shlomim or are we talking about a toida? Clearly, from this pasuk, you see that the carbon toida was a type of shlomim. So there were different types of carbon shlomim. Toida was really one sug of carbon shlomim. So how exactly do you bring a carbon toida? So the first thing the Torah says, "V'hikriv al zevach hatoida chalois matzos belulois bashemen urikike matzos meshuchim bashemen v'soiles murbeches chalois belulois bashemen." The pasuk continues. It says, "Al chalois lechem chametz yakriv karbonai al zevach toidas shlomim." So the carbon, the animal itself, it sounds like it's just going to be a shlamim. But in addition to the animal, in addition to the shlamim, there are also going to be breads. And the Torah describes 4 types of breads. You have chalois, matzos, belulois, bashemen, breads that are matzah, like most menachos were, that were belulois bashemen. We know what that means. Then you had rikike matzos, again matzos that were meshuchim bashemen. We know what that means. Belulois bashemen versus meshuchim bashemen, as in the Minchas Mafei Taner. Then there was a 3rd type of bread, soiles murbeches chalois belulois bashemen. So what exactly is that? So Rashi says this is bread that was exposed to very hot water. Then it was baked, then it was fried. We'll see about that in the Gemara. And then finally, the 4th type of bread wasn't matzah at all, but rather al chalois lechem chametz, yakriv karbonai, al zevat toida shlamos. The Torah describes 4 different types of breads. We know, we just had the Mishnah in yesterday's daf, we'll see it again in today's daf, and that is that each type of bread really came in multiples of 10. Thus, if there were 4 types of breads, times 10, you ended up with 40. But one thing is clear, the pasuk seems to describe 30 of the 40 breads, or 3 out of the 4 types of breads, as matzos. It's the 4th one, it's the latter 10 that are achalois lechem chametz. And it's a very big chiddush, because the Mishnah says, kol ha-menachos bayis matzah. But there were 2 exceptions to the rule. The 2 exceptions were the shtei alechem, you had the lachmei toida. So the lachmei toida had 10 breads that weren't matzah, but rather were chametz. So 4 types of breads, each one came in sets of 10. Thus there was 40, 30 of them were matzah, 10 of them were chametz. The pasuk continues, it says, you have to take one of each type of bread and give it to the kohen. It's truma. The kohen that does the avodah, he's the one that's going to get these breads. What about the meat of the shlamim? It has to be eaten on the day that the carbon was brought, which means you could eat it that day and at night. Just can't leave it over until the following day. So essentially what we have here is a carbon known as the carbon toida. The carbon toida was a type of shlamim, but there were 2 very important, 2 distinct differences between the carbon toida and an ordinary shlamim. Number 1, bread. An ordinary shlamim did not have bread. Now, there were shlamims that had bread. The kifsei atzeres, which was the shalmei tzibur that was brought on Shavuos, came along with the shtei alechem. The ayil that the Nazir brought when he completed his nazirus was a shlamim, and it too came along with chalois nazir. So, we're not saying that there was never a shlamim that had breads, but most shlamims did not have breads. This is an example of a shlamim that had breads, 40 breads. This is particularly unique in that the breads themselves were actually chametz, or some of them were, not like most menachos that were bayis matzah. The other unique characteristic of the carbon toida is the toida, being that it was a shlamim, was kachim kalim. And kachim kalim ordinarily was nechel shnei yomim, v'layla ech kachim kadashim, when it was eaten, as in the chatas, as in the asham, was only eaten liyom v'layla. The carbon toida, despite the fact that it was a carbon shlamim, thus it was kachim kalim, still the Torah says very clearly, b'yom karbana yeyachel, lo yiniach mimenu ad boiker, that it was treated like kachim kadashim in the sense that it was only nechel liyom v'layla. As far as why? Since you do it in a tziv, and Others say it as well. I saw the Lutzgerov in his name, the Torah says it, that it's not so much that the Torah was more Kaddish than a classic Shlamim, but rather the whole purpose of the Torah was you're giving Haidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you want to be Mefarsim the Nes. So what did the Torah say? The Torah says, I want it to be a bigger carbon than an ordinary carbon. Ordinary carbon, you have meat. Over here, in addition to the meat, you're going to have bread. Not just, but you're going to have 40 breads. 4 has to be given to the Kohen. But you're left with 36. So you're going to have a lot of breads, and you can only have one day to eat it. So you have a bigger carbon quantitatively, you have less time to eat it. What are you going to be forced to do? Make a Suda. You're going to be forced to invite people. By you bringing people over to you, you'll have an opportunity to give Haidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Rabim, and that's the purpose. The purpose of it being a bigger carbon, that's the first unique characteristic of the Torah. And having less time, that's the second unique characteristic of the carbon Torah, is all in the spirit of what the Torah represents, and that is Haidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, more specifically, who had to bring a carbon Torah, and what was the theme of this Haidah that a person is supposed to internalize and think when he brings the carbon Torah? We'll see later in the course of the daf, but for now we have a not such easy daf to learn. Zok the Mishnah, Torah, I feel like I say that every morning. So how much flour was used for the breads that made up the carbon Torah? So the 40 breads in its entirety, start off with flour. How much flour was used? Says the Mishnah, it was 5 sa'in Yerushalmiyos, shehem sheish midbariyos, which is the equivalent of 6 sa'in midbariyos. So the sa was one of the metrics that were used by Chazal. And the size of the sa changed from the time that the Yidden were in the Midbar until they settled in Yerushalayim. So what was once 6 sa'in, when the Yidden were in Yerushalayim, became 5 sa. In other words, the size of the sa became bigger. So the sa now held more than it had previously held. Bottom line is the Torah was 5 sa Yerushalmiyos, which are 6 midbariyos. And the Mishnah continues to break down these metrics. Shtei ephos, as it relates to the 6 sa in midbariyos, if you want to break them into ephos, it comes out that it's essentially 2 ephos. Also a measurement. Ha'ephos shalish sa'in, because an ephos 3 sa'in. So if it's 6 sa'in, we're talking about the sa'in midbariyos, and 1 ephah has in it 3 sa'in, so do the back of the envelope arithmetic, 6 sa'im are going to have 2 ephahs. Esrim isarai. Additionally, the 6 sa'in midbariyos, which were 2 ephahs, were made up of 20 isaroins, or 20 esroinim. What's the reason? Because isaroin means a tenth, but a tenth of what? A tenth of an ephah. So if you have 2 ephahs, how many tenths of an ephah do you have? You have 20. So essentially, the sheish sa'in midbariyos were 2 ephahs, which were also 20 isroinim. Asar l'chametz v'asar l'matzah. What they would do is they would take the 20 isroinim, 10 of them would go for the chametz, 10 would go for the matzah. It's a chiddush, because we said that out of the 40 breads, only 10 were chametz, 30 were matzah. So it's being divided very disproportionately. But it had to be divided equally, not amongst the breads, but amongst the chametz breads and the matzah breads. So half of it was going to go towards the chametz, despite the fact that chametz only represented 25% of the kamus of the chalis teida, and the other 10 went for the matzah. Asar l'chametz, the 10 that went to the matzah comes out isarin l'chala. It comes out 1/10 or 1 isarin went for each challah. Why? Because you have 10 esroinim that are going for the chametz. Each chametz is really made up of 10 breads, because we said that each min was made up of 10. So if you have 10 esroinim for all the chametz, so it comes out you have 1 isaroin for each challah of chametz. Asar the matzah, the other 10 went for the matzah. But matzah shalish minim. The matzah was made up of 3 minim, like we spoke at in the intro. Chalois, rikikim, urevucha. Nimtzuz, it comes out shloisha esroinim v'shlish l'chol min v'min. If you have 10 esroinim for 3 minim, how many esroinim for each min? So it's 10 divided by 3. So it's 3 1/3 esroinim for each min. The shalish chalois liyisar. If that's the case, it's 3 1/3 for each min. Each min is made up of 10 chalois. So how many esroinim in each chala? 1/3 of an isarin. Which means then that there's 3 chalois in 1 isarin. It's the flip side of the same coin. And that's what the Mishnah means when it says v'shalish chalois le'isaris. If you want to really break it down, that's essentially what the Mishnah did in terms of how much flour there was in each one of the breads. So you start off with sheish sa midbariyos, which is the same as 2 ephos, which is the same as 20 esroinim, has to be divided equally, so you know how many esroinim are used for the chametz in totality, how many are used for the matzahs in totality, and you could break it down into each challah, how much you're going to end up having. Each challah on the chametz side is going to be made up of 1 isarin of silas. Each challah on the matzah side is going to be made up of 1/3 of an isarin. That's using the midbariyos metric. What about on the Yerushalmiyos metric? It would be the Yerushalmiyos hayeshloishim kav. So it was made up not of 6 sa'im, but it was chamish sa'im Yerushalmiyos, which converts, it's the equivalent of 30 kav. Chamisha also the chametz, half of it was given to the chametz. So 15 kabin was on the chametz side. The chamisha also the matzah, 15 kabin was on the matzah side. Chamisha also the chametz, the 15 kabin that were on the chametz side. Kabu mechza lechala. So if all the chametz had 15 kabin and the chametz was made up of 10 breads, so it's 15 divided by 10, it's going to come out kavu mechza, 1.5 kabin for each challah. Chamisha esrei the matzah, 15 were for the matzah side. Uber matzah shalosh minim, the matzah wasn't made up of 1 min, but rather the matzah was made up of 3 minim, chalois v'rikikim v'revucha, nimtzu chameshes kabin l'chomin. So it comes out that each min had 5 kabin. Now each min had 10 chalois, so if 5 kabin has 10 chalois, it comes out that each challah has a half a kav. Thus, there are 2 chalois to the kab. Shtei chalois the kab. And that's exactly what the last line in the Mishnah means. So the first thing the Mishnah said was that the Taida was ba chamesh son Yerushalmiyos, which the Mishnah said was also sheish son midbariyos, which the Mishnah said is also sheish son midbariyos is 2 ephos. How do I know that? Because each ephah is 3 sa'im. Says the Gemara, Minoani Mili, so it's unclear from the Gemara itself what Minoani Mili is, but if you take a look at Rashi, Minoani Mili, the ephah shalish sa'im. How do you know that an ephah equals 3 sa'im? So the Gemara, Rav Chizda said, Amar Krobix, the Pasuk says, and this is a Pasuk in Yecheskel Perek Memhei, ephah v'habas, toichen echad yir. The ephah and the bas, both are the same shear. So a bas is also a measurement. You have an ephah, you have a saw, you have a kav. There's something called a bas. A bas usually means a daughter. But bas in Yecheskel Perek Memhei means a measurement. And what's the size of the measurement of the bas? It's the same exact as the ephah. Okay, so ma bas shalish sam. Just like the bas, we know was 3 sa'im. Af ephah shalish sam. So for the ephah, was shalish sam. Says the Gemara, bas kufim. How do you know that the bas was shalish sam? It's not a befurish pasuk. So how do you know that? Do you know it from the following pasuk? It says, Loses masar hachomer habas, that the bas was meiser of the chomer. So you want to know the size of this measurement known as the bas? It's 1/10 of what the chomer is. As if to say that we know the chomer, therefore, is 30 sa, and the bas is 1/10 of the chomer. 1/10 of 30 sa is 3 sa, and that's how you know that the bas is 3 sa. If I know the ephah and the bas is the same, because so I know that the Eifa is also 3 sa. But the Gemara says that can't be the Makar. You know why? Because Eifa Nami Yoksiv, it says regarding the Eifa as well, in that same pasuk, that the Eifa is also Asiris of the Chaymer. So if I know that the Chaymer is 30 sa, then I don't need the pasuk that says the ephah and the bas are the same shear to tell me that the ephah is 3 sa. Because just like I know that the bas is 3 sa, I know the ephah is 3 sa. How do I know the bas is 3 sa? Because it says it's 1/10 of the chaymer, I know the chaymer is 30 sa. It says the ephah is also 1/10 of the chaymer, and I know the chaymer is 30 sa. So from the fact that we need, Rav Chizda said, I need the pasuk or ephah bas toichen echad, meaning I have no information about the ephah, but I have objective information about the bas, and I know the ephah and the bas are the same thing. That's how I know the ephah is 3 sa. This can't be the makar. It can't be that you know anything from this pasuk. It must be from a different pasuk. Also, Yecheskel Perek Mem. Hey, it's 3 psukim later. The pasuk says, "V'choik Hashemen habas Hashemen u'meiser habas men hakur aseres habatim chaymer ki aseres habatim chaymer." Okay, it's a long-winded pasuk that we don't really need now, other than one line. The line that we need is u'meiser habas min hakar. That bas is meiser from the car, and we know the car is 30 sa. That's something we know. Thus, if the bas is meiser from the car, the bas must be 3 sa. I know the ephah and the bas toichen echad yilehem. That's why I know the ephah was 3 sa. As a result, if the Taida came from Sheish Sa'in Midbar, these are all Sa'in Midbariyas, these are Psukim in Tanakh. So if the ephah was Sheish Sa'in Midbariyos, I know that Sheish Sa'in Midbariyos equals 2 ephahs, because each ephah is the equivalent of a bas, which is made up of 3
So in Zok the Gemara, if the Chachamim wanted to increase the size of the measurements, they could do it, but they can't do it more than a sixth. So this is if they wanted to increase the weight of different coins, they couldn't do it more than a sixth. The hamnestaker, a third halach, also regarding a shtus, that if somebody is a businessman, he's a retailer, he buys wholesale and he sells retail, so we max his profit margins. He's not allowed to make more money than a sixth. But the first halacha was that ein moisifen al hamidos yosim mishtos. Now when Shmuel is referring to shtus, and very often when Chazal refer to shtus, they don't mean what the man on the street thinks a shtus is, right? What does a shtus mean? A six. So Shmuel said a halacha that you're not allowed to add to the midos more than a six. So what it sounds like is that I can't add more than 1/6 to what I have. So if I have 6 units of something, I can add 1 unit on top of that. But I can't add more than that, because then I would be adding more than a 6. I'm not allowed to add more than a 6. It's not what it means. Shtus means milagav. And what shtus milavar. And what shtus milavar means is that you're not allowed to add a fifth. Shtus is a 6, it's not a fifth. The point is that if you add 20% to something, then it comes out that the thing that you added, that 20%, will now represent 1/6 of the total amount. So for example, if I start off with 100, and now I add 20%, I'm going to have 120. That hisafa, the addition, is going to be 20 of the 120, which represents 1/6. So when Shmuel said that he meant the shtus milavar. He didn't mean that you could add 20%. But the point is, it can't be that what you added will represent more than 1/6 of the total amount once you already added what you added. But regardless, so the first halacha was, why not? So Gemara says a nice reason. Maybe the reason is because if you're going to increase the measurements, then obviously prices are going to go up as well, proportionally. So it used to be that a saw of chitin cost $1. Now the saw's bigger. They were just moisif the saw. So now it's going to cost $1.10, $1.20. Why is it going to cost more? Simply because you're getting more. Right? It's not like you're making more money, more volume, but you're not making more money. The point is that prices went up because the measurements went up. You know what we're worried about? Maybe Shmuel was worried about the slippery slope. Once you raise prices, even though you're not really raising prices, this saw just got bigger. Memela, when you buy, you're buying more, thus you're paying more. But the concept of prices going up is dangerous. It's a slippery slope, and as a result, we want to make sure that up to a shtus, yeah, but more than a shtus, not. But the Gemara asks the obvious question. If that was Shmuel's cheshbon, I just wanted to make sure that the economy stays in control, right? We're regulating the interest rates, that's what's going on here. But shtus not miloy. But then why even a shtus? If you're worried about the slippery slope, what's the magic to the shtus? Sounds like there's something to this number. Elazar, you know what the number is? Because we're all familiar with the laws of Vaina. What's the laws of Vaina? If somebody sells something and he either underpays or overpays, up to a shtos, mechila. Shtos, the halach is, the mekach is kaim, but you have to return the difference. If it's yoisem shtos, then it's already a mekach tois, and if you want, you can unwind the transaction. So the shayla, what happens if somebody was a meicher, and the measurements went up, and this person forgot that the measurements went up, so he sold based on the new measurements, but the old price. So the meicher ended up losing out because he's selling more and he's getting less. Now, if you can move the measurements, yoisem ishtos, then it's very likely that that will happen. And in the case that this meicher goes ahead and sells, the number that he's off by, that he undercharged by, is going to be Yosem Ishtos. And if it's Yosem Ishtos, he's going to want a Bittul Mekach. And if there's going to be a Bittul Mekach, a fight's going to break out. And that's not something we want. So maybe the number Shtos actually has a methodology to it. It's related to the halach of Shtos Bayayna. Because we're worried that if you're going to raise the prices, it's very possible it's going to lead to Ayna until people in their minds adjust. They're not going to realize prices change. And you're going to have a Meicher who's going to end up selling for Yosem Mishtos. He's going to be the one that's going to lose out. And we don't want Mekach Tois. But the Gemara says that can't work either. Because if you remember from Perek Hazov, that anytime you're dealing with a Davar Shebemida, something that's measured, something that's weighed, something that's counted, you don't have the halach of Shtos. And this is clearly a Davar Shebemida. That's what we're talking about. So obviously, there's no halach of Shtos. Again, that can't be the Svara of Shtos. It's a nice Svara what Shmuel said, but that can't be Pshat in this halacha. Because at the end of the day, B'nei, there is no halacha of shtos when it comes to a davar shebe midah, shebe mishkol, shebe minyan. Ella, the Gemara says, mishon tagra. You know what the reason is? The first halacha Shmuel said, Ein Ma'isifan ala midas yosem mishtos, is related to the third halacha that Shmuel said. Hamistakel lo yistakel yosem mishtos. What was the third halacha? He said there's a profit margin that you get maxed out on. You're allowed to make up to a 6 profit, but you can't make more than a 6 profit. So we're worried about that case where a person, the moicher, is not going to chap. He is going to sell the new measurement for the old price. He's going to end up losing. If we say that we cap out the amount that we raise the measurements and you can't raise it more than a shtos, then this person says Shmuel's really not going to lose out. Because we know what his profit margins are. It's a 6. So the 6 that he's going to lose is his profit. I don't care so much if he loses his profit. But if we can raise the midos yosem mishtos, so it could be he's making 1/6 profit, but he just got nailed. Because we raised the yosem mishtos and his hefsid was worse than that. So the reason Shmuel said we can be moisef ala midos is for the chashash that the Gemara just said. In the tzad that it thought that maybe it's related to the laws of Ainah. Because we're worried about an Ainah situation. But not Bittul Mekach. Because if the concern was Bittul Mekach, then even Pachas Mikshtus would be a problem. Because Kol Davar Shebe Mida, Afilu Pachas Miktei Ainah Chayzer. It's a whole different cheshbon. The cheshbon is that we don't want this person to end up losing out. If we cap it by a 6, I don't think he's going to lose out. Because being that the halacha is that you're allowed to charge, you're allowed to make profit up to a 6, presumably, there's a 1/6 profit margin built into the sale of whatever it is this meicher is selling. So if we say that Mida can't be more than a 6 anyways, the worst he can do is break even. But the Gemara says breaking even is not good. Says the Gemara, Elamishun Tagra, Gehechi Deloy Limtaya Hefseda. The Gemara says Hefseda, who Deloy Limtaya Rafchalei Boy? Wait, you're only worried about this person not losing his principal, but you have no problem with him not making any money? Zavin Zvin Tagra Ikri? A person that goes ahead, right, he makes it up in volume, right? But somebody that just goes ahead and he sells and he doesn't make money, well, what is that exactly? No. If we're going to protect the meicher, we can't just make sure that he doesn't lose his principal. We have to make sure he makes a few shekels also. Says the Gemara, Elam Rav Chizda. So Rav Chizda said, I hear. Shmuel Kra Ashkach V'Darash. We're trying to figure out why Shmuel said this halacha. Right? You see in our Mishnah that they used to manipulate the measurements. There were the Sa'in Midbariyos, and then there were the Sa'in Yerushalmiyos. You see, it could be Moisef Alamidos. The question is, what's the Makar? But Shmuel came and said a halacha up to a 6. Why? So the Gemara had svaris, we knocked it all out. Must be it's based on psukim. Again, a pasuk in Yecheskel. Hashekel Esrim Geira. The pasuk of this is describing the shekel. The shekel was made up of 20 Geira. Esrim Shkolim, 20 shkolim, chamisha ve'esrim shkolim, 25 shkolim, asara ve'chamisha shekel, 15 shkolim, hamani yilachem. So there's something called geira, there's something called shekel, and there's something called a mana. The shekel is made up of 20 geira. The mana is made up of shkolim. How many shkolim? Esrim shkolim, chamisha ve'esrim shkolim, asara ve'chamisha shekel. Do the math. 20 plus 25 plus 15 is 60. So essentially, the mana was made up of 60 shkolim. Now, each shekel was made up of 4 dinarim, which means that if the mana was made up of 60 shkolim, it was made up of 240 dinar. Faith the Gemara, mana masin varba and hava. Is that true? A mana was made up of 240 dinarim. It's not emes. It was really made up of 100 dinarim. Again, that's something that comes up a lot. If mana was made up of 100 dinarim, was made up of 25 shkolim. Each shekel was made up of 4. So what's going on here? Was it made up of 240? Was it a shmami not class? You see 3 things from here. Shmami na mana shel kodesh kafel. This Yecheskel was describing a mana shel kodesh. The mana shel kodesh must have been twice the size of the mana shel chulim, which is something again that comes up another place in Shas. So that's a premise we can very easily accept. 2, the shmami na meisif and alamidos. You see that you can be meisif alamidos, and this pasuk in Yecheskel is describing an era where they were meisif alamidos. And you see, how much could you be Moisef? Shtos. Meaning, really, a mana is made up of 100 dinar. But this was a mana shel kodesh. A mana shel kodesh is made up of 200 dinar. But Yecheskel's mana is not 200 dinar either. It's 240 dinar. You know why? Because he added a shtos. How is 40 a shtos of 200? Right. Back of the envelope arithmetic. It's a fifth. It's a shtos. Milavar. Because the 40 that you added represents 1/6 of 240. The bottom line is the one pasuk I have, Shmuel said, that was megalatos, this concept of being Ma'isif and Alamidais, is a case we were Moshe of a 6. So it's not based on any svar, nothing to do with the profit margins of the Meicher. It's simply Krakar of the Ashtach, the Darash. That's where Shmuel got his halacha. By the way, Vishmam, you see a third thing, Shtusam Alavar. Ravina. So Ravina said, after all this, Masnisa Namideka. And that's why we're talking about this. There's a raya from our Mishnah. The Mishnah said, the saw was made bigger because what used to be 6 sa'im now became 5 sa'im. How much did they make it bigger? 1/6, and it was a shtus milavar. Shmam, you see from our Mishnah, raya to what Shmuel said, that there's some methodology to the number shtus. So shtus comes up a lot when you learn the sugyas of Aina and Perek Hazav, the 4th Perek of Mesechtes Bava Metzia. There's Shmuel's well-known halacha where he used to cap out the moichem. He didn't let you make more than a 1/6 profit margin, but it's also very important when you're dealing with midos and mishkol and you deal with all these different types of halacha. There's something called a shtus, because ein ma'isif and alamidas yosim shtus. Why? The Gemara had some nice svaras. But at the end of the day, it's really learned out from a pasuk in Yecheskel, so much in Kachim, and so many halachas I learned out from Yecheskel. There's many, the Gemara often asks me, before Yecheskel came around, who knew this halacha? The Gemara always gives the same teretz. Then it was halacha l'meishim yisinai, v'asi Yecheskel v'asmechei akra. But there's so many halachas. Halachas Avelis is learned out from Yecheskel. Many halachas that are learned out from Yecheskel. So you could chalk this up as another halacha. It's also many psukim Yecheskel that contradicted psukim in the Torah. We learned the Gemara together. That's the Gemara in Mesechtes Menachos. Regardless, it ties back to the Mishnah, because the Mishnah talks about 2 measurements, and the measurements are off by 1/6, and it's a shtus milavar. Shma mina, it's a raya to Shmuel's halacha. So before we go weiter to the second part of today's daf, so we mentioned part of the introduction to the carbon tide, and again, the topic of the next week of Daf Yomi is going to be the carbon tide. So we said the carbon tide is a shlamim, and it's unique in 2 ways. Number one, it came along with chales, 40 chales, 4 different types, 3 of them were matzah, 1 of them was chametz, each one had 10. There was a mitzvah to give truma from the chales. We'll see about that on Amud Beis. Another thing that was unique about the carbon taida is that whereas ordinary kachim kalim was nechel shnei yom v'layla achas, when it comes to the carbon shlamim, the Torah says b'yom karbana yeyach. So who brought a carbon taida? Who was chayv to bring a carbon taida? So Rashi in Chumash in Parshas Sav tells us, Im al toida yakriven, Rashi, Im al dvar hoida al neshen asaloi. If a person is now bringing a carbon because he wants to give Haidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because of a miracle that happened to him. K'goy, Yordei Hayam, v'holchei midbariyos, v'chavushe beiso asurim, v'choyle shenes rapa, shehem tzrichem l'hoidais, shekasu lehem yoidu l'Hashem chazdoi, v'niflois al l'vnei Adam, v'yizbechu zivchei toida. So malachas me'elin od ha'shlamim alalu. So if the person bringing the shlamim is one of those 4 people, shalmei toidein, it's a special type of shlamim, it's called the shalmei toide, utunais lechem ha'amr b'inyin, ve'enan it says Rashi, who brings the carbon taida? It's the arba, it's the 4 people that are tzrichim l'hoidis. Now the arba tzrichim l'hoidis are of course Mesechtes Brachos daf nun daled on the base Perek Haraya fame. The Gemara over there says Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav arba tzrichim l'hoidis Yordei Hayam holchim midbaros umisha haya chayla v'nesrapa umisha haya chavush bebeis asurim. And this is of course brought down in Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber, we always speak this out, and Siman Ratio Test brings this halacha, and at the end he says v'simancha. If you want a good siman to remember who are the 4 people that have to bring lahoidas, the pasuk we say in Shemay Nesri, v'chayil hachayim yoidu chasela. Chayim is Rosh Tevos, chavush Yisurim, that's a chayla, yam and midbar. So the chayil hachayim yoidu chasela, ches yud mem. That's the 4 that are tzrichim lahitz. Now, Pashat, this Gemara in Brachos Nundalad Amid Beis is not discussing the carbon taida. It's discussing birchas hagoyim. That's why it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. You don't have an Eirech Chayim Hilchas Bracha is Siman Ratio Test, a halacha regarding the carbon taida. What you have is a halacha regarding Binchas HaGoyim. In fact, the next halacha in Shulchan Aruch, halacha Beis, Umam Mevarech, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, HaGoyim Melech Hayavim Toivim, Shegmalani Kol Toiv. Vashoyim Omer Misha Gmalcha Kol Toiv, Hu Yigmalcha Kol Toiv Sala. It's a Mechaber and Siman Ratio Test. They've got analysis, they've got mitz. But Rashi is applying and saying that if the Gemara says in Brachos, Nun Daled Amid Beis, that arba tzrichim l'hoida is birchas hagoyim. Also, it makes sense that you have a carbon taida, which is a carbon that was brought for the purpose of hoida, obviously it makes sense that the ones that are chayiv to bring the carbon taida are the ones that Chazal said had to make the birchas hagoymel. So it's this v'chayil hachayim. They're the ones that today make a birchas hagoymel, and they're the ones that b'zman shebeis hamikdash hayikayim also had to bring a carbon taida. There's an interesting discussion in the Rishonim whether a person can bring a carbon taida as a neder or as an adav. Let's say somebody decides he wants to bring a carbon taida. Now we spoke outrage in the past. Rabbeinu Bachai in Parashas Sav, Rabbeinu Bachya says that once upon a time a chosin and a kala used to bring a carbon taida. That's what they used to bring, carbon taida to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to thank Hashem for the fact that they found their shidduch. We spoke at a gevaldige shagasarye in Gvurus Hariyah Masechtas Tainus after the story with Choni Amagel. The Gemara says they brought a parshal hoidah, the miracle where they had borrowed a lot of money, and then Hashem caused it to rain even after the sun had already set. The sun came out, right? An unbelievable story. And they brought a parshal hoidah. Rashi says, why was it called a parshal hoidah? Because they were misvada on the par. Hoidah miloshen vidoy. But the shagasarye says v'li nera that it wasn't a Hoidah miloshen vidoy, it's Hoidah miloshen. They gave shvach for Hoidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, because even though Chazal say abot tzrichim b'hoidahs, but of course it doesn't mean only those four. Any person that wants to give Hoidah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu can bring a carbon taida. And he says the Shagasarye that after the story that took place, Ein lechanes gadol mizeh, if there was a time where the Yidden owed a carbon taida, this was the time. So there's nothing to talk about, says the Shagasarye, that lulei de mistafina, when the Gemara says parshal Hoidah, I don't think it means Hoidah miloshen vidoy. That's a doichek. It's Hoidah miloshen shvach v'Hoidah. It's a carbon taida. Klal Yisrael brought a carbon taida. We spoke this out in the world of Lumdis because it would come out maybe that there was a carbon taida that was a carbon tzibur. In the Briska Shiurim, they asked this in the beginning of Masechtas Zvachim, that the Gemara there says that there's no such thing as a taida that was the only shalmei tzibur was the kifsei atzeres. Did you ever have a carbon tzibur that's a taida? Here you have Klal Yisrael brings a parshal hoidah. Shagasarye says that it was a carbon taida. Maybe it was a carbon tzibur. It was a carbon tzibur. The tzibur brought it. They paid for it. They bankrolled it. But did it come from the machzis hashekel? Did it have a halacha of a taida tzibur? So the inkan makamel. But the bottom line is arbot. That's Rashi and Chumash, but there's a Rabbeinu Bachai and a Shagasarya and this raid that it's not only these four, but really any person who feels a debt of Hakaras HaTov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once upon a time, can go to the Beis HaMikdash and he could express that feeling of Hakaras HaTov by bringing a carbon taida. There's another pasuk in the Torah that describes the carbon taida, and that's in Parashas Emor. Pasuk says, "V'chizbechu zevach taida l'Hashem." If you're going to bring a carbon taida, l'rtzoinchem tizbal. You should bring it l'rotzei. And it's a little bit out of context. In fact, the context of the psukim there are very tricky. Ayin Rameir Simcha Mashachachmi goes through beautifully, explains what the theme of the psukim are. First, the Torah talks about the halacha of mechusar zman, that you're not allowed to shech the carbon until it's 8 days old. Then the Torah talks about the halacha of oisei v'espenoi, lo'isishchatu b'yom echad. Then the Torah talks about the carbon taida, and then you have a pasuk about chilul Hashem, a pasuk about kiddush Hashem, and then you make kiddush. Eila mayadei Hashem mashet tigrois. So those are the psukim over there in Parashas Emor. But tucked away, you have two psukim that talk about the carbon taida. V'chizis b'chuz zevach taida l'Hashem, l'tzoinchem tizbach is number one. Number two, b'yom hahu yeyachel, lo'isayisir mimenu ad boiker ani Hashem. But what does the pasuk mean when it says l'tzoinchem tizbach? So you're bringing a carbon taida, you should bring it l'tzoinchem. So Rashi quotes a Torah's Kayanim that says, don't bring it with a machshavas pigel. So the word l'tzoinchem has super lumdisha connotations. It has nafkaminas in the world of pigel. Then Rashi quotes a Gemara Chulin Daf Yud Gimel l'tzoinchem means l'daitchem mikan lemisasek shepasul b'shchitas kachem. So that word l'tzoinchem bothered Chazal as well. And Chazal took out, they extracted from this word l'tzoinchem sugyois aruchos in Shas. But I saw that the Chasam Sofer in the Svarim and the Ksav Sofer both quote from that flaw. So that flaw, of course, was the Chasam Sofer's Rebbe. In his Sefer Panim Yafas, sword inside, says something beautiful. He says that very often, if a person was in an Eis Tzara and he was saved from the Eis Tzara, so he feels a debt of Hakaras HaTov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He benches Hagoymo. He makes a Suda Saidah. Maybe he takes upon a Kabbalah. In the B'zman Shebeis HaMikdash HaYikayim, he's going to bring a carbon taida. That's normal. That's the way people usually are. But says the Panim Yafis, I have a better idea. Says a person wakes up in the morning and he's not in an Eis Tzara. He says that's definitely a reason for a person to want to bring a carbon taida. It's definitely a reason for a person to give a Shvach Haidah. He says, why do you have to wait until you you find yourself in a situation, creep out of the situation to give Eidah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, Fakir, wake up in the morning and say Moedim with Kavanah that you were spared and you never put into that situation. It says that's what the Torah is saying. Don't wait until you don't wait until you find yourself in an Eisara. You know what you should do? Do it on your terms. Do it on your terms. Do it b'Torah's neder, b'Torah's nedava. Go give HaKadosh Baruch Hu shvach v'Eidah for the fact that you're not in an Eisara and that you don't have this obligation. That's the emphasis. Of course, there's abat svichim l'hoidos, but the emphasis of the pasuk of l'tzoinchem tizbachu is to try to do it on your own terms. The Ksav Sofer himself says a different daher, and he says something beautiful as well. He says that very often, if a person goes through an Eisara and he creeps out, he realizes how much he grew because of the Nisayan and because of this challenge that he faced. Nisyanos very often make people stronger. And he says that that's what the Torah is saying. The Torah is saying that a person, when he brings the carbon toida, it should be l'tzoinchem. It should be that I'm happy. It's b'rotzoin that I'm bringing the carbon toida. It's not that, oh, thank you Hashem for putting me back into the situation that I was in before and averting, Chalila the tzara that could have came about because of this Nisayan. To the contrary, feel that the tzara that the person was in actually made him stronger, and as a result, he said, I'm so happy to do this. I'm doing a beratzin because I realize now that this tzara that I was in was for my benefit. It made me stronger. I grew as a person because of that, and as a result, I'm so excited. I'm so happy that I'm bringing this carbon toida. Not just I'm happy that I'm back to status quo, but because I appreciate that I'm in a better place than I previously was. The obvious sushal to this is the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi, and Parshas B'Shalach, say he brings a medrash pliya. It's a medrash rabba. The medrash says on the pasuk, Oz Yashem Moshe. Zok the medrash, Amar Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu said, Ba'oz chatasi, I sinned with the word Oz. She'omarti, because I said to me, Oz basi ledabre al paroi heira la'amazeh, Ba'oz ani omer shira. Moshe Rabbeinu said that I sinned using the word Oz. In the end of Parshas Shmois, so Moshe Rabbeinu is sent to Pari for the first time. Let my people go. And what happens? Pari says, Tichbada avodah alanos. I see the Jews have too much time in their hand. They're already thinking about coming free. This is insane. Make them work even harder. And the pasuk goes on to describe that Pari's initial reaction to Moshe Rabbeinu's request to let the Yidden leave Mitzrayim ended up backfiring terribly. Vayoshem Moshe al Hashem. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes back to Hashem. Vayomer Hashem lo mahari yoysa lo mazeh. Why did you send me to make it worse for the Jews? From the time that I went to Pari, all these donas make it worse. And then, of course, that's the segue right into Parshas Va'era, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Va'era Lavra, Mel Yitzchak, Vel Yaakov, Bekel Shaka, Yushmi Hashem, Lo Nedati Lem, and Rashi says, Chaval al Da'av, Nevelo Meshtakrin. Then Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem says, Ich benk sich noch the Avos. The Avos never questioned me like this. And Moshe Rabbeinu, 1 minute things go wrong, and all of a sudden, says the Medrash, Moshe Rabbeinu said, I sinned using the word Oz. I said, I'm going to now sing Shira using that same word Oz. Oz Yasher Moshe. It's a Medrash clear. Says the Beis Halevi, Pshat the Medrash like this. He says that when Moshe Rabbeinu sang Shira, and he realized what came from Shiva Mitzrayim, because the Yidden were in Mitzrayim for Redu Shanim, and they left with Nisim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed the world that he's the Boirei Umanik, and he started making Nisim and Aflois, and the Yidden was Zoicha Tigiluyim. They got the Torah. And Rasa Shivcha Bayom Ashalei Ro Yecheska Babuzim Yoilam, and the tremendous Kiddush Hashem that came about through Yetzias Mitzrayim. Moshe Rabbeinu realized that it was worth it to be in Mitzrayim for 210 years. It was all Kedai. Because had we not been in Mitzrayim, we would never been Zoichet to what we were Zoichet to. So Moshe Rabbeinu says that I'm not just singing Shira on the fact that we were saved from Mitzrayim. That, now we're free. That whole situation was averted. We're going to block it out of our minds. We never have to think about it. No, just the opposite. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I realize now that what I thought was bad was all for our good. In real time, I couldn't process it. It didn't make sense. I didn't chap. But now, that what I thought at the time was what I thought was what I thought was now I'm going to say shira on that gufa because I realized that this was necessary. This was something that I needed to do. Beis Halevi teaches, he says that's what David HaMelech meant when he said Oitcha Hashem ki anisani vatili l'Yeshua. You say it in Hallel. Oitcha Hashem ki anisani vatili l'Yeshua. After you have the Yeshua, you can give Eidat HaKadosh Baruch Hu ki anisani. You thank Hashem for the year because a person is supposed to realize afterwards that the Nisayan, everything that he went through, and says the Ksav Sofer, that's the emphasis over here. The Korban Toida is v'chisis b'chuzevach Toida l'Hashem. It should be not begrudgingly, okay, Baruch Hashem, disaster averted. No, it should be with an element of rotz. I'm so happy I could give HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aidah for the fact that I was in a situation, I crept out of the situation, I grew as a result of it. That's the emphasis, says the Ksav Sofer, of L'Tzoinchem Tizbachu. Zogt the Mishnah right there. Nikulam hayanoitel echad me'asara truma. So again, the Korban Toida was made up of 4 types of breads. Each bread had 10. From all 10, you took 1 and you gave it to the kohen as truma. Remember, the hikrim yimenu echad mikol Korban truma l'Hashem. Echad, from the word echad we learned, we had this in yesterday's daf, shlo yitel paras. You have to give a complete challah. Mikol Korban, we learned, sheyiu kol hakarbanos shavos. In this context, the breads are referred to as carbon. All the carbonas have to be equal. So you can't take, let's say, 2 from the Meshuchin Bashemen on behalf of the Meshuchin and the Belulai. So it has to be equal. So you give it to the kohen. The rest of it was eaten by the Baal. From the words Vikri Menu, we learn we learned that it has to be mechuber. So the 10 chalis had to be together, like in one basket, when you were mafresh the truma from the lachmi toida. Echad, we learned shlo yitel paras. Mikol Korban, shiyu kol hakarbonei shavos, like the Mishnah said, shlo yitel min hakarbon al chaver. Truma l'Hashem. When it says truma, any of them come. How much is truma l'Hashem? Never can truma, but never trumas meiser truma. It says truma over here by the trumas lachmi toida, and it says by trumas meiser the word truma as well. A Levi that gets meiser has to give truma from his meiser. Trumas meiser is like meiser; it's 1/10. Afkan echem me'asara. Here too it means one. Never can truma. It says here truma v'nemar bebikurim truma, and it says by bikurim truma. Ma'lahalan ein lo shir. Just like bikurim has no shir, afkan ein lo shir. Maybe this has no shir. So is it 1/10? Does it have no shir? Near l'midaim. So is lachmi toida more similar to trumas meiser, or is it more similar to bikurim? Done. Truma she'en achret truma mi truma she'en achret truma. On the one hand, the trumas lachmi toida is similar to the trumas meiser because they're both truma she'en achret truma. You don't have to give any truma after you give trumas meiser. You don't have to give any truma after you give trumas lachmi toida. Vayechichu bikurim, which is called truma, but she'esh achret truma. What truma do you have to give after bikurim? Truma, Meiser, Trumas Meiser. Bikurim is just the beginning. When it starts growing, Reishis, Bikuri Ad Mascha, Tavi Beis Hashem Lekecha. But then when you harvest the field and the Gemar Malach and everything, then you're going to have to start giving your regular Trumas. Oy Klacha Derech Zu. Done in Truma HaNecheles B'Makom Kadosh, Mi Truma HaNecheles B'Makom Kadosh. The Trumas Lachmei Toida had to be eaten B'Makom Kadosh. It was Kachem Kalim. Bikurim also had to be eaten only in Yerushalayim. Val Teichiach Trumas Meiser, Shenecheles B'Chol Makom. So on the one hand, Trumas Lachmei Toida is more similar to Trumas Meiser. On the other hand, it's more similar to Bikurim. Says the Gemara, Mimenu Truma Hashem. It says the words Mimenu Truma Hashem, Viksib Trumas Meiser, Mimenu Truma Hashem, Ligzera Shava. So I learned from Trumas Meiser that the Trumas Lachmei Toida has to be 1/10. Lamadu the Truma She'echem Me'asara. So I know that Truma is 1/10. How much challah, how much soilus are you supposed to have? So the Mishnah already addressed it. 5 saw in Yerushalmiya is 6 saw in Midbariyas, but here the Gemara is going to give us the Mekayos. Hareini nemakan lechem. It says lechem regarding the lachmi. Toiv never lahalam b'shtei lechem lechem. It says by the shtei lechem lechem. Halahalan isaron lechava. Just like the shtei lechem, each of the 2 lechems had 1 isaron. Together they were 2 isroinim. But each one was 1. Afkan isaron lechala. So too, each chala has to be made up of an isaron. Oy klach l'derechzu. Nemakan lechem and never lechem aponim lechem. Ma'alahalan shnei isroinos. Afkan shnei esroinos. Maybe each challah has to be 2 esroinos. Near l'midaim. Done a mincha haba chametz in zevach. Mi mincha haba chametz in zevach. Vayuchiach lechem aponim she'enei ba chametz in zevach. So again, the question is: should we learn lachmi toida from shtei lechem, or should we learn lachmi toida from lechem aponim? Says the Gemara. There's 2 similarities between the lachmi toida and the shtei lechem. Number one, they both come with a carbon. The lachmi toida comes with the toida, which is a shlamim. Shtei lechem comes with the kivtzei atzeres. Additionally, they're both chametz. The shtei lechem was chametz, and the lachmei toida had chametz as well. Va'al yoichiach lechem aponim she'enei bar chametz. It's not chametz. It had to be matzah like all menachos. Im hazevach, it didn't come with a carbon either. Klach l'derech zu. Done mincha ba mi eretz v'chutz la'eretz. min hachadash umin hayashan, min mincha haba, me eretz, v'chutz la'aretz, min hachadash umin hayashan. V'ayuchichu shtei halechem she'inei bayis ela min hachadash min haaretz. There's a similarity between the lachem toida and the lachem hapadim, because they both can come from either Eretz Yisrael or chutz la'aretz. No halacha where the tefua has to come from, and it can be chadash hayashan. Shtei halechem had to be from Eretz Yisrael. There was no shtei halechem. We learned these gemaras together when the Yidden were in the midbar, and also it had to be min hachadash. Talmud loymar mi moish v'yseichem taviu lechem tenufa shtayim. In the parsha of shtei halechem, it says the words mi moishvoy seichem taviu shein tamud lemer taviu not tamud lemer taviu shekol mashat mevi mimakam acher harehu kazeh. It's coming to be marba something else. What's it coming to be marba? It's coming to be marba the lachmei toida mala halani sar lachala. Therefore, I learn lachmei toida from the shtei halechem, and just like the shtei halechem, each chala had an isar, and afkan isar lachala. Im mala halan shnei esroinos afkan shtei esroinos. Why don't you say that we learn each chala of the lachmei toida from both shtei halechems? Meaning, we're learning it from one. Each of the shtei halechem had an isarin, and so each one of the chalas by the lachmi toida we say had an isarin as well. But really, the shtei halechem were two. Thus, shtei halechem. And if each one had an isarin, together they were really two israinis. So maybe each chala by the lachmi toida should be learned out from the shtei halechem together. Each one should be two israinis. Talmud loy matiyena, the Gemara on the bottom of the Amud is going to explain what this drasha means. Look at the last line. Amar mar Talmud loy matiyena, my Talmud. Good. Lamadnu asara lechametz, asara lematzah minayin. So we know from here that the chametz part of the lachmi toida, which is the part of the lachmi toida that we could learn out from the shtei halechem, so shtei halechem was also chametz, was made up of 10 esrayim. How do we know that? Because we said that each chala was like each of the shtei halechem. Each of the shtei halechem was one isarin. Thus, each bread of the lachmi toida was a shtei halechem was also an isarin. If there were 10 chametz, so I know together they made up 10 esrayim, which reconciles with what we discussed in the beginning of the daf. How do you know that the matzah also was made up of 10 esrayim, which is a much bigger chiddush? Because we said the matzah had 30, so essentially the per challah ratio is going to be much less. It's going to be a third. Talmud loymer al chalois lechem chametz. Regarding the lachmi toida that were matzah, we compare it to chametz. Al chalois lechem chametz neged chametz haba matzah. That the same proportion, the same amount of silas that you're going to have for the chametz, you should have for the matzah. Nimtzu esrim esroinos lachmi toida. You start off with 20 esroinos. Asara lechametz, asara lematzah. Yochel asara shebematzah yukulam elim benechet. I would think that just like the chametz, the 10 of the chametz were all one min. Maybe all the matzah should be the same min. Talmud loymer. That's not an option. It's a pasuk in the Torah. It's not even a drasha. This is a pasuk in the Torah. It says imal toida yakrivenu v'hikriv al zevach hatoida chales matzahs b'luas b'shemen urikike matzahs b'shugam b'shemen sayos murveches. Clearly, three different minim. Nimtzu shloish esroinim v'shlish l'chol min v'min. So it comes out with 3 esroinim and a shlish for each min, because if there's 10 esroinim for the 3, divided equally, it comes out 3 1/3. So it's 3 1/3 for each min, which means that each chala is a third of an isarin, which means that there's 3 chalos to 1 isarin. V'shalish chalos li'isarin. The Mishnah said this already. V'nimtzu lachmi toida arba'im. So it comes out at the end of the day. You have 40 breads. That makes up the lachmi toida. Noitel mehen arba. The 4 of them go to the Kayin, and the other 36 were eaten by the Bailam. It says that you have to take off Truma from the Lachmi Toida. How much is Truma? We learned it from Trumas Meiser. We know that it's 1/10. But at the same time, each group of 10 had to be mechuber. They had to be together, like in one basket. The 10 had to be a unit. How do I know that? Because it says vehikru mimenu. The pasuk says kol chel bayarim mimenu. It says you're supposed to take the imurim out of a carbon and you put it on the mizbeach. And the Torah says the same lashon. The chelev that's going on the mizbeach yarim mimenu hasam ma'im mechuberika. What does mechuber mean? We're dealing with an animal. The Gemara says no. Could Rav Chizda means something there too? Amar Rav Chizda shlo yenatach basar koidem sheyito. Imurim. What it means is that you shouldn't cut up the animal before you take out the imurim. So you should try to make the animal as whole as possible when you remove the imurim and you put it on the mizbeach. Because it says mimenu, just like it says mimenu over here, it means there's some singular connotation in the word mimenu. It actually makes sense in the context of imurim as well. One last Gemara. Amar nemar kan shrum of never b'shumas meiser shrum. Right, so just like Shumas Meiser, Shum means a tenth, so to here, it means a tenth. And Neilach Shumas Midyan, Freit the Gemara, maybe we should learn from the Truma of Midyan. Now, what was Trumas Midyan? So, Trumas Midyan is mentioned in Parshas Matos, and over there, after the Yidden took the spoils of Midyan, they had to give Truma. And the Torah says that they had to give 1/500th to the Kayin, and 1/50th to the Levi. So says the Gemara, maybe learn it from Trumas Midyan. So the Gemara says, done in Truma Hanehegas L'Dairos, Mi Truma Hanehegas L'Dairos, Val Teichiach, Trumas Midyan, She'en Hanehegas L'Dairos. That was Irasha. Why would we learn from Trumas Midyan? V'neilach Mi Trumas Chala, freak the Gemara. Maybe learn it from Chala. What do you want to learn from Chala? So if you look at Rashi says, Dahavi Echad Me Arbam V'Shmeina. Maybe we should learn from Chala. Just like Chala, it's 1/48th. So maybe here too, you're supposed to give 1/48th. Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, Donim Davar Shenema by Mimenu Trumas Hashem, Midavar Shenema by Truma Hashem, Lafuke Trumas Chala Delay Nema by Mimenu Truma Hashem. Again, it's the words Mimenu Truma Hashem that you have side by the Lachmi Toida and by the Trumas Meiser that links them together. In theory, maybe you can learn it from Trumas Chala, but it makes more sense to learn it from here rather than from this. So the last two Gemaras that we learned are both very interesting. The Gemara says that there's a halacha that you had to give Truma from the Lachmi Toida. How much was the Truma? Gemara says we learn from Trumas Meiser, which is 1/10, that this Truma was 1/10 as well. So it's 40 breads, 4 go to the Kayin, that's 1/10, the other 36 on Nechal Abayim. Faith the Gemara, maybe learn it from Trumas Midyan. Another kasha. Maybe learn it from Trumas Chala. What was Trumas Midyan? 1/500th. What was Trumas Chala? 1/48th. And the Gemara gave a teretz. Trumas Midyan, that was a Rasha. Trumas Chala doesn't have the same wording, the exact same language that you have by Trumas Lachmi Toida, whereas Trumas Lachmi Toida and Trumas Meiser do have the same language. So working backwards. The Gemara asked the kasha, learn it from Trumas Chala. So Rashi, well, it's Trumas Chala. It's 1/48th. This Rashi is a Tamir Gedoyla. Why? Because we know that Meiser has a shir, Trumas Meiser has a shir. There's many shiurim in the Torah. They're all halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Ironically, Truma, the basic obligation for a person to give Truma, with the kedusha of the Truma and only the kinds of Truma and the chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, has no shir. In fact, the Gemara says chita achas poiteres hasakri. Now chala is to dough what Truma is to tvua. Chala is also truma. Reishis arisay seichem. It's a reishis. And just like truma itself has no shir, chita achas beteres asakri, really chala has no shir either. And even though what Rashi is saying, 1/48 has a makar, there's makaris tissue, but those are all the rabbanon de geshiurim. They're not the raisa de geshiurim. So the shoyel in Shilas Tshuvas Noida Yehuda asked the Noida Yehuda in Yeridea Tinyana Simin Reish Aleph. This is a well-known tshuva. He said, "What's Pashup Shad in this Rashi? This Rashi is Sisrei Torah." The Gemara is asking a kasha. You should learn a Gzeir Shava that the halacha of Trumas Lachmi Toida should be learned out from Trumas Chalu. What should it be? 1/48. 1/48 is a Shir Rabbanon. Rashi knew it was a Shir Rabbanon. So how in the world could the Gemara ask a kasha, learn Gzeir Shava from a parsha in the Torah that has a halacha that's only a din d'Rabbanan? And the Rebbe Yehuda famously said, to answer this kasha and other shitas Rishonim and Shas, a very, very important yisod. Says the Rebbe Yehuda, there's two halachas whenever you talk about Truma, whenever you talk about Chala. One halacha is that you have to be mafresh Truma in order for your tefua not to be tevel anymore. So if you have tefua and you're not mafresh Truma, the halacha is you're not allowed to eat it. It's tevel. Tevel carries a misa v'dei shamayim. It's very, very chamer. There's another halacha that you have to take the Truma and you have to give it to the kohen. There's a mitzvah's essay da'iraisa to take the Truma and give it, do a Maisa Nesina, give it over to a kohen. Now, if you just said a chiddush that the Gemara says chita achas beteres hasakri, that Truma and Chala have no shir midayraisa, that's as it relates to being mata the tevel. As it relates to being mata the tevel, you take one chita, you push it to the side, you're done. There's no shir dayraisa. Any shir would be on a D'Rabbanan level, but there is no shir deraisa. But as it relates to the second part of this, to be mekayim the mitzvah nesina, to give it over to the kohen, there's a shir deraisa, and that's pshat in this Rashi. Of course, it's a shir deraisa. It's not chita achas beteres hasakri, and that's why the Gemara asked the kasha that being that you do find the shir deraisa of chala and chala's truma, maybe you learn trumas lachmi toida from trumas chala. That's the first hara. The second hara is the Gemara says learn it from trumas midyan. So what exactly is trumas midyan? What's the rest of the story? So the rest of the story again. These are psukim in the Torah tucked away in Parshas Matos. The Parshas Matos, which follows the story of Bilam and Shreiras HaMidyanim v'Hikisa Moisam. So the pasuk over there says that Hashem tells Moshe it's time to take revenge from Midyan. After what Midyan did to the Jews, the Bnais, it's time to take revenge. go and fight a war. And then there's pasuk after pasuk after pasuk that describes in very great detail what the Jews were supposed to do with the shalal, with the biza that they took back from Midian. First they had to kasher all the kalims, you learn different halachas of Haggalah from there, but the pasuk says as follows, as it relates to us. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe leimar, sa es roish malkayach hashvi ba'adam u'bebehema, atav elazar ha'kohen v'rosh yavis eidah. I want you to count up everything that you captured. The human spoils, the slaves, the behemoths, everything. And then you should take the biza and you should divide it in half. The ones that went out and fought are going to get half. And the rest of Klal Yisrael is going to get the other half. And now you should give truma. What should the truma be? For every 500 people that you captured, you have to now give 1/500th as truma. Umina adam, umina behemar, umina chamayrim, umina tzay. Mi machzisam tikach v'nasatel Elazar ha'kohen trumas Hashem. You give it to the Kohen Gadol, Elazar. He's going to get the trumas Hashem. Umi machzis b'nei Yisrael, and then from the other half, from the b'nei Yisrael, so have tikach echad achuz min ha'chamishin. You should take 1/50th. Again, min ha'adam, min ha'behema, min ha'chamir, min ha'tzay, min ha'chal and that you don't give to the Kohen. V'nasatel oisam la'leviyim. Shemim mish. But we need the first half. The first half is do his truma. The Torah calls it v'nasatel Elazar ha'kohen trumas Hashem. And what was the trumas Hashem? You're supposed to take 1/500th of the spoils of Midian, of the human spoils, the bakar, the chamayrim, and the tzayin. You're supposed to give it to Allah. So you have a sugi over here where the Torah says you're supposed to take truma from the lachmei toida. How much truma you're supposed to give? Says the Gemara, you learn it from trumas meiser, which was 1/10. Maybe learn it from the spoils of Midian. And just like there was 1/500th, maybe here too it should be 1/500th as well. And the Emma says, if you think about it at first glance, it's like, why would you have a half a meter to learn up from Trumas Midian? And which is really the Gemara's teretz. The Gemara says, the Dairis Mishal lo yalfinan. But the Havamina itself is Sarach Bir. But it could be the Havamina's half of a fella. And that is that the Pasuk says in Parshas Vayechi. The Parshas Vayechi, the Pasuk over there is talking about Binyamin. Binyamin ze'ev yitraf, ba'boiker yoichal ad, V'lo erev yichalik shol. Says the Targum Onkelos. Binyamin ba'arei tishrei shchinta ubachsante yispeni makdasha. We know the Beis Hamikdash was bechelkoi shel Binyamin. B'tzafra ubepanyo yohoin makrivin kanaya karban. At night and in the morning, the Kehanim are going to bring karbanos. Uleiden ramso in the evening yohoin mefalgin moisar chukoin mishar kuchaya. They're going to take all the kachim and they're going to divide it. So at first glance, the pasuk says Binyamin zeiv yitraf. It's like a wolf. He does his thing in the morning, and at night he divides his shalal. But says Targum Onkelos that, of course, we don't mean Binyamin's a wolf. There's dvarim niskavim that are merumas in this pasuk. And what's merumas is that Binyamin had in his chelik the Beis Hamikdash. It was bechelkei shel Binyamin. And what went on in the Beis Hamikdash? In the morning they were fighting. There was wars going on. Yohim makriv and kanaya korbana. Uleid and Ramso. And then in the evening they would sit and they would divide all the kachim. V'la erev. And in the evening yichalik shal. Reb Shmuel Yankov and Zoisli Yaakov, and on this pasuk right here says that it's half of a fella. You see that the Targum Onkelos is teaching that the avodah that went on the Beis Hamikdash as babayke yechalad. It's a milchama, it's a tutzach milchama. And then when they divided the kachim, what's it compared to? V'lo erev yichalik shalom. It's compared to the urchei hamilchama coming back from war and sitting down and dividing the spoils. And he said a davar nifla. He said that the pasuk says, "Vayil kehanim haLevim kol shevet Levi chelik v'nachla im Yisrael." The pasuk says the kehanim and the Leviim didn't have chelik v'nachla in Yisrael. Ishe Hashem v'nachalasa yochelu. It's a pasuk in Devarim Perik Yukes pasuk Aleph. Says Rashi, the pasuk says that the kehanim and the Leviim will not have chelik and they won't have nachala. Chelik means they're not going to have biza. They didn't participate in the biza. Nachla means they didn't get part of Eretz Yisrael. Concludes the pasuk, Ishe Hashem v'nachalasa yochelu. Zok the Heilige Rashi that because of the fact that they don't have chala, shala, that's the part that we need right now. They don't have biza. You know what they got instead? They got instead kachim. So it says the pasuk, Lo yilukei hanam levim kol shev v'chelik v'nach. What's chelik and nachla? They didn't get biza. Jews used to fight wars. So they come back from war. There was biza. You could be dealing with real money. They don't have anything. They also don't own real estate in Eretz Yisrael. They don't have any chelik in Eretz Yisrael. You have to give them something else. Ishe Hashem What they get instead is they get their nachla, which is the matnas kuna. But what do they get instead of biza? What do they get instead of shalol? They get the ishe Hashem. Said Rav Shmuel Yankiv, that's this Rashi, that's this Targum Onkelos over here. Ula erev yichalik shalol. What's the shalol of the Levium? What's the shalol of the Levium? They don't have the regular shalol, but they have a different shalol. They fight different wars. The Yidden fought wars out in the battlefield, and their shalol was Adam, Behema, Malkayach. That's what the Chamayrim and Soin. The Levium are fighting different wars. They're fighting Keneged the Koiches Atoma, and they're fighting wars in the Beis Hamikdash, Keneged the Sitra Achra. But they also have a shalol. What was their shalol? Their shalol was that they got to divide the kachim. But the point is, it comes out of half of a fella. What is Chalukat's kachim? It's shalol. It's v'la erev yichalik shalol. Uncle says v'la erev yichalik shalol. Ul'iden ramso yohim mefalgin moisar chulkoi mishar kutshaya. Rashi and Chumash. V'yir luki animal avim kol sheva levi chelek. What does chelek mean? They don't get pizza. Instead, what do they have? Ishe Hashem v'nachalaso yochelu. They get Ishe Hashem. They get the karbonis. The karbonis were shalol. Maybe that was the havamina of the Gemara. Says the Gemara, we're dealing over here with Trumas Lachmi Taida. This is not Bikurim. This is not Trumas Meiser. This is not challah. This is lachmi teda. What's lachmi teda? It's kachim. It's v'la erev yichalik shalom. Oh, you see that kachim is called shalom. So we have precedence. In the world of shalom, there's a concept of truma. What's the truma? 1 in 500. So time is the Gemara. So maybe we should learn out from truma smidya. Says the Gemara. I hear. It's a nice hara. But at the same time, shad midayra is layafir.